and get us started here so we don't run too much over. My name's Kate Kelly. I'm with the Hinesburg Conservation Commission, and we are leading a new effort here in town to have a natural resources inventory done in town. Jesse Moore is our consultant. He's with Native Geographic, and he did over the last year or so, Jesse, maybe year and a half, completed for us a online mapper, which includes a variety of different layers that you'll get to see tonight, related to our natural resources here in Hinesburg. This was sort of the initial phase of this project. After this, we'll be moving on to a second phase, which will include more detailed, like on the ground work that Jesse will talk a little bit more about tonight. As far as Zoom goes, I'm sure you guys have all heard this, being Zoom experts, but we'll try to stay muted tonight just so we don't get a bunch of background noise. And the meeting is being recorded so we can share after the fact with people who couldn't be here tonight. The only other request I have of you is if you're the type of person who likes to follow along with what someone on the screen is doing, which is kind of what kind of person I am, we request that you don't log on to the natural resources viewer because apparently if we have too many people logged on, it can crash the server. So we don't want to do that tonight. So we're going to have Jesse just be the one sharing his screen, and then after the fact, we'll be sure to share the links out so you guys can go explore and send your feedback off to us after the meeting tonight. Okay, with that, I will be quiet and I'll have Jesse take it away.
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. I am going to start sharing the screen here. Give me a second. Fantastic. Is everyone looking at my PowerPoint slide here? Awesome. So tonight, just to give it a little bit more of a context, tonight I'm going to be sharing results from the Phase 1 Natural Resource Inventory. And this was mostly a remote or a computer-based assessment. You know, this involved gathering and compiling existing data, as well as doing some sort of remote data analysis and remote mapping. This was supplemented with a little bit of site visits done as part of this project, as well as drawing upon some of my other experience doing site work in Hinesburg. But we are, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about transitions tonight. You know, we're sort of in a time of transition with this project where we're going to be trying to do some more sort of boots on the ground assessment. In case I happen to have anyone on the call tonight who gave us permission to visit their property as part of the Site 1 assessment, thank you very much. Boots on the ground assessments really help. They help us understand your property. They also help us understand your neighbor's property and your neighbor's property. You know, when I get to put boots on the ground, it lets me extrapolate what I learn over a much larger area. So if we had any site Phase 1 landowners on the call tonight, thank you. And we are going to be asking permission to come do some visits for our Phase 2 work as well. So thank you in advance for anyone we may have on the call who may give us permission for some of our future work. So just a brief outline on tonight's talk. You know, tonight we're really going to be talking about, you know, the natural resources and some of the natural resources layers. I'm not going to be delving into the online mapper tonight. That's there and for folks to explore now. Well, for the outline tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the land cover, regional context of the town. We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about habitat blocks, so areas of unfragmented forest and other wildlife habitat that's, you know, relatively sparse on people and anthropogenic land covers. Talk about water resources and wildlife resources. Then we'll end talking a little bit about agricultural resources and sort of the interface, how that interfaces, agricultural resources interface both with farming and people, but wildlife as well. So in terms of questions, we'll have some question and answer time at the end. You are also welcome to plug in comments into the chat as we go, at a very least as a way to catalog your question. So just looking at land cover in town, This is land cover from 2016 data. And Hinesburg is, well, one of the things that I think is really makes Hinesburg special is the diversity of experiences you get in a very small area. So it's, I have an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old. I spend a lot of time at creamy stands this time of year. And there is an analogy for Hinesburg at the creamy stand, and that's the twist. Not just the twist, but chocolate ice cream, vanilla ice cream, and the twist, and maybe even the twist with some sprinkles on top. And I'll start with, one of the plain experiences. I don't know if it's the vanilla or the chocolate, but Hinesburg is mostly forested. About 65% of the town is forested. And one of the things I find most neat about Hinesburg is when you are deep in the forests of Eastern Hinesburg, particularly, it feels like a forested and wild town. It feels like you're in a wild landscape. It's hard to imagine, just a mile away, you're in a mostly farming landscape and open landscape. So when you're in the forest, you get this really rich forested experience. It feels like a forested town. And then you go a mile away and you're out into this really open working farm and open landscape of Western Charlotte, the Champlain Valley, Western Hinesburg in the Champlain Valley. Open grassy covers and shrubby covers. And these are, mostly agricultural hayfields, agricultural pastures, as well as, the large lawn. And this is the other side of the experience, maybe the chocolate. And when you are out in the farm fields, it feels like a working farm town, and it feels like a substantial working farm town in some places. And it's hard to imagine just a couple miles away, you have these really, really, really deep woods, and you have the wildlife and experiences of the really deep woods. And all this is in super close proximity to each other. It's a pretty unique situation, pretty unique aspect in a lot of the towns I've been in. And one of the things I think that makes Hinesburg really special is you have, this deep woods experience, you have the agricultural experience, and then you sort of have the mishmash of the two where they meet, and a lot of other sprinkles on top as well. So about 2% of the town is covered by water, either being like Lake Iroquois in the top image, Lewis Creek in the bottom. And then another, just a little over 2% of the town is also covered in, urban and built up covers, whether that's a paved road, parking lots. Something like 0.4, 0.3% of the town is covered by buildings. So rounding down to 0% in this graphic here. Take a step back and think a little bit about the regional context. Understanding the regional context of Hinesburg is really important for understanding, at least in my opinion, what makes Hinesburg special. So Hinesburg is on this transition zone of a couple of major biophysical regions in the state. So as ecologists, we've broken the state up into these biophysical regions where there's relatively homogeneous patterns of geology, vegetation, land use, and land cover. Hinesburg straddles really the transition from the Champlain Valley to the northern Green Mountains. And these have very different geologies, different climates. Of course, the Champlain Valley is a relatively moderate climate. And Champlain Valley gets a lot less precipitation than other parts of the state because of the rain shadow effect from the Adirondacks. And one of the other things that really sets the Champlain Valley apart is its sort of long and sustained history of agricultural uses. This is very different, of course, than the Green Mountains, much cooler climate, least historically farmed region of the state. And then you have this biophysical region in between the Champlain Hills, which in many ways is a biophysical region of transition. It's the foothills of the Green Mountains. It's the transition from the Champlain Valley to the Green Mountains. And it sort of shares attributes with the two surrounding biophysical regions. It has a climate that's similar to the Champlain Valley, but it has a geology much more similar to the Northern Greens. Just continuing to look a little bit more at the biophysical regions for a second. Of course, the Champlain Valley, as those of you that live there know, this is the most developed part of the state. It's where most of the agricultural of the state is. It's not that there isn't forest in the Champlain Valley. There's plenty of forest in the Champlain Valley, but it tends to be these smaller blocks of forest, these smaller areas of forest, contrasted with the northern Green Mountains, which is, of course, predominantly forested with small areas of residential development, mostly in the valleys. And then the Champlain Hills is sort of somewhere in between the two. Champlain Hills certainly has a long history of sustained agriculture as well, particularly during the peak sort of sheep clearing era. Most of the Champlain Hills was also farmed and open. Since that time, more of the hills and the mountainous terrain has sort of returned to forest cover. And at least in the Champlain Hills, we see a lot more of the agricultural and developed covers in the valleys. The Champlain Valley is certainly defined by its underlying geology, bedrock geology, and superficial deposits. It is remarkably different from rest of the state. It's underlain by these bedrock types that are very easily eroded and weathered. And it's underlined by bedrock types that weather and erode to perform or generally form calcium-rich soils or enriched soil growing environments, basic pHs. Very different than the northern Green Mountains that are underlain by bedrock types that are very resistant to weathering and erosion and tend to produce more acidic growing in conditions. Northern Green Mountains and the Champlain Hills are both primarily mantled and till laid down by advancing and receding glaciers. And this is very different than what's happening in the Champlain Valley. At the end of the last major glaciation period, 10 to 20,000 years ago, primarily the Champlain Valley was inundated by these glacial lakes and eventually the Champlain Sea, a marine body. And in those watery environments, there were very different soils laid down in the deep water environments, particularly in the western edge of Hinesburg and even deeper moving into Charlotte. You get these really deep clay deposits that were deposited in the deep water environments of these glacial lakes. And then you have along the near shore and shoreline environments, including bands in Hinesburg, you have these sandy soils, and particularly sandy over silt soils or sand over clay. And then in the upper reaches of, the upper elevations of town, eastern side of town, you have your more standard glacier till, which is covering most of the state. And, it's this gamut, this diversity of substrate types that gives Hinesburg sort of its diversity of ecosystems, diversity of wildlife, and its real diversity of different land uses, working forests right next to working farms. You also can't talk about the regional context of Hinesburg or really any town in the Champlain Valley without also thinking about climate change and discussing climate change. So anyone who's a gardener in the Champlain Valley knows that, over the last iterations of the USDA hardiness zone, we've seen the Champlain Valley warm in a plant hardiness zone. This is 2006. Hardiness zone is probably ever closer to getting to a warmer zone now. And, we know that wildlife are responding to this warming temperature. This graphic is actually from the Nature Conservancy. And what it's doing is showing the modeled or predicted migration patterns of wildlife species, groups of wildlife species in response to changing climate. And one of the things that we see in this model, and we see this replicated in a lot of climate migration models, is there's this tremendous funneling effect along the Appalachian Mountains into the Northeast, into the Green Mountains, into the Adirondacks, into the White Mountains of Maine, into the Western Mountains of Massachusetts. And that funneling effect in the Northeast, you see that on all sorts of different models, whether it's done by the Nature Conservancy or some other organization. So that's a really important sort of continental context for connectivity in the Northeast. We know that connectivity and the capacity for animals to move, to migrate, move in response to climate change, the Northeast is going to play an important role in that. There have been dedicated efforts in the Northeast to look at connectivity across the Northeast. Staying Connected Initiative is sort of one of the larger projects looking at. Staying Connected Initiative is a collaboration of international fish and wildlife service agencies, state fish and wildlife, state wildlife agencies, as well as conservation organizations. And What they're looking at is identifying important areas for connectivity and wildlife movement across this region, and then strategies to conserve and protect those. And that regional understanding of connectivity filters down into how we look at connectivity in the state of Vermont. So what you're looking at on the right, all the areas in green, these are highest priority connectivity blocks identified by the Vermont Conservation Design. This is the statewide program I'm going to talk about in a second. So the idea is that this land of connected habitat blocks on the right facilitates animal movement throughout the state. It facilitates animals as they move within their home range. And it also provides this really important connection. It's part of this big connection in the Northeast. And one of the things I want to point out is that Hinesburg, which is outlined in red right here, is sort of on the periphery of this highest priority, this network of highest priority connectivity blocks in New Hampshire, or excuse me, in Vermont. And so what does that mean that it's on the sort of margins of it? Well, I think it means that Hinesburg has to be really intentional about connectivity and about managing for, planning for, conserving connectivity. You know, if you are on the spine of the Green Mountains in one of these priority connectivity blocks, your town has so much forest cover in it that wildlife are able to pretty freely move throughout your town without a whole lot of intentionality. When you're on the edge of this connectivity network, it means that that connectivity is not as pervasive in the town. And, for Hinesburg to enjoy the benefits of this connected landscape, like having wide-ranging species like bear and moose occasionally in town, it means that Hinesburg needs to be intentional about finding these important areas for connectivity and then, managing them or conserving those to sort of maintain that function. So the Vermont Conservation Design was a project that was recently wrapped up by Vermont Fish and Wildlife. Just want to introduce it here because we're going to look at a couple of their data layers tonight. So it was done by Fish and Wildlife Department, and what they did was came up with this conservation plan, or really a conservation vision, of the parts of Vermont that are most important for sustaining sort of the full range of biodiversity in town, or the full range of habitats that occur across the state. And they've identified all these different layers and they stitch them together into what you see here on the right. And conceptually, if these parts of the state are maintained in an area that maintained in a condition where you have relatively natural cover, which is mostly forest, it doesn't mean that people can't be in these. It's just you're trying to maintain predominantly forest or natural covers. If we're able to do that, we're able to conceptually maintain the full array of biodiversity that's currently in Vermont, and that we should be able to do that as these species move about in response to climate change as well. So they looked at a bunch of different layers and stitched a bunch of different layers together to come up with this conservation vision or conservation design. And we briefly looked at connectivity blocks. We're going to look at interior forest blocks next. So just another one of the lenses that they use to identify these important areas. So now we are looking at the highest priority interior forest blocks in the state of New Hampshire. So interior forest is the parts of a forest block that are removed from the edge or the margins of the forest. For a species that's living in the forest edge can be very different than interior forest. Forest edges are drier, sunnier, windier environments. Species there can be subject to higher levels of predation, herbivory, stresses from invasive species. So there's a number of species that simply do best in interior forest environments. It's not that they need interior forests, it's just they tend to have higher levels of breeding success when they have access to interior forest as part of their home range. These are all species that we find in Hinesburg, and here I've kind of divided ones that go from benefit from interior forest to ones that benefit from connected interior forest. Moose, black bear, goshawk, fisher, bobcat. These are species that need interior forest, but they need lots of it. They need access to lots of it. which in Hinesburg means connecting multiple patches of interior forests together. I'm going to come back to that thought in a second. So here you are looking at a map of a remap of the highest priority connectivity in interior forest blocks and priority connectivity in interior forest blocks. So when Vermont Conservation Design, they mapped habitat blocks all across the state. And when they did that, they used land cover data from the 2000s. And what we did was updated the mapping as part of this resource inventory. We updated the delineation of these habitat blocks based on more recent land cover and land use patterns. They were looking at like 2006 land cover data when they did this. We know Hinesburg has changed a fair amount since 2006. So we redelineated some of these forest blocks. We did not change the ranking on them, but we did redelineate them. So a couple things that I wanted to point out on this slide. Where my cursor is you see a highest priority interior forest block. It's also a highest priority connectivity block. In terms of the state level analysis, this is the only state level highest priority block in the town. And it's, these interior forest blocks were partially ranked based on the size of interior forests. They were ranked on some other attributes as well, such as underlying geology. And in the interior forest, the highly ranked interior forest that we see in Hinesburg, it's not big by state standards, but it's big in terms of Champlain Valley. This is, a couple hundred acres in size, less than 1,000 acres in size, which compared to some of the habitat blocks along the spine of the Green Mountains that may be, 20,000 acres in size, it's small. But as you look out into the Champlain Valley, there's not a lot of habitat blocks that start getting up into that couple hundred, over 500 acres in size. So that's one of the reasons why this is a highest priority block in town. Also, it's underlying geology. So it's a little hard to see on the map here, but you can see the biophysical region boundaries here. And this is clearly out into the Champlain Valley. So they were also ranked based on their underlying geology, and the Champlain Valley has unusual underlying geology relative to rest of the state. So habitat blocks out in the Champlain Valley were also considered a priority because they have these really uncommon underlying geology. One last thing I want to point out is these blocks on all the blocks you see outlined in yellow are priority interior forest blocks. So at the state level, they didn't rise to this highest priority designation, but they did meet this sort of next criteria as a priority one. And just because they're not a highest priority in the state doesn't mean that that translates to them not being a highest priority at the town level. If the town wants to have species associated with interior forest, things like bear and moose, these are the largest habitat blocks in town, the ones along the western side. These are in the 2,000 to 3,000 acre range. They're the biggest habitat blocks in town. So, while these may not be a highest priority at the state level, they're certainly a really high priority at the town level. So connectivity among interior forest blocks is immensely important in Hinesburg. So what we're looking at here is a series of species of greatest conservation need. These are all species that do occur in Hinesburg. And you're looking at their home range sizes. In most of the habitat blocks, the largest one in Hinesburg maxes out at about 3,000 acres or something, maybe 3,500 acres. The vast majority of them are, under a couple hundred acres in size. Yet we find bear, which needs almost 20,000 acres, in a lot of Hinesburg and a lot of the forested parts of Hinesburg. And that's because bear are able to connect multiple small habitat blocks together. That's the only way, that's the way that Hinesburg maintains some of these species on the landscape, is maintaining connections between these separate habitat blocks, because there's no one habitat block large enough in town to sustain these species. So we're going to delve into road crossings here a little bit. So road crossings are places where animals are crossing the road, and we're going to describe road crossings here both for the furry wildlife creatures, but we also need to think about road crossings in terms of plants. Plants are not actively moving across the landscape, but suitable habitat at the roadside helps plants as they are dispersing seeds and migrating through seed dispersal. So really good road crossings allow for wildlife movement as well as plant dispersal. And typically, the best wildlife road crossings are ones that provide connections between adjacent habitat blocks that allow species like bear to connect these separate areas of interior forest. Good road crossings typically have natural cover at the roadside for the critters to hide in and for the plants to grow in. And they typically have terrain that's accommodating for wildlife movement. So, for instance, steep rocky terrain, moose and deer are often not going to move across. So in order for a road crossing to be functional, it also needs to be of a terrain that's going to allow wildlife species to navigate. So we are looking at one more data set here. That's a combination of data from Vermont Conservation Design, as well as some data from the town, wildlife corridor and linkage data. And so what the state has done as part of Vermont Conservation Design is they've used computer models that are looking at proximity to habitat blocks, terrain at the roadside, and vegetation at the roadside to model where they think that the best road crossings are. So the ones in red are the ones they think are going to be best for terrestrial species. The ones in blue are areas they think are going to be best for riparian or aquatic species. And this is all based on computer models. This is not based, at least in Hinesburg, most of this is not based on the ground tracking. What Hinesburg does also have is these wildlife corridors that are in crosshatches that were delineated within the town. And some of this is, this is informed by looking at habitat at the roadside, but some of this is also informed by sort of biological knowledge of what's going on. So I actually think that road crossings, of all the things I'm going to talk about tonight, I actually think road crossings are one of the most vulnerable natural resources in Hinesburg, most vulnerable to loss of land use conversion and sort of other stresses and threats. And because wildlife road crossings are so important in the town, because that's the only way we have species like bear and moose connect these interior forest patches, I think wildlife road crossings are an area where we need to continue to do inventory work in town, which is why at the end of our phase one work, one of our recommendations was to do a boots on the ground assessment of road crossings to actually find places to find biological evidence of where wildlife are using the road crossings. So we can whittle down the road crossings that were modeled by the state are quite extensive and cover a lot of road frontage. What we want to try and do is narrow down to the ones that not only look good in a computer model, but there's also a sign that wildlife are actually using those. So that's one of our phase 2 studies. And when you're looking for biological evidence of wildlife road crossings, sure, if you're actually able to see the wildlife cross the road or someone can tell you, that's fantastic. But mostly what we're doing is looking for sign or evidence that these species were there, not necessarily the species. So this includes winter tracking along the roadside to look for tracks of wildlife sign. Like you see on the left, insect, and then the top right insect is actually a bear-clawed telephone pole, which is another indicator along our roadsides that bear are coming through that area. So, you may see me out and about in your town. So this winter, we're going to start the roadside tracking surveys and wrap them up the following winter. So you may see me out and about on some of your roads, looking down at tracks at the roadside. And that's what I'm up to. The Vermont Conservation Design also looked at aquatic habitats. and they looked at aquatic habitats through a couple lenses. One is they identified these highest priority aquatic habitats across the whole state. I'm going to talk about those in a second. They also identified what they're calling our priority surface waters and riparian areas. So besides just the stream, creek, or river, in this analysis, they've also included the valley, the adjacent landforms that are interacting with those waterways. These are the floodplains, the valley bottoms, areas that interact with the waterway. And that these, adjacent riparian areas and the waterways, they provide important habitat for aquatic species and riparian species. They also accommodate and provide space for sort of stream processes, floodplain processes, and stream evolution. And then the other really important part of these riparian areas, and we see this a lot in Hinesburg particularly, is they help provide connectivity even among terrestrial habitats. So species like fisher, like bobcat, who spend more time in terrestrial environments will actually use riparian areas to connect separate separate habitat blocks. And those priority areas are mapped in sort of green in this map, and it's hard to tell in PowerPoint, but the Lewis Creek and parts of Hollow Brook have been identified as the highest priority aquatic habitat. And folks have known about Lewis Creek in the state for a long time. As long as I have been working in Vermont, Lewis Creek has been cited as sort of this exemplary aquatic feature. And generally, the state is using two criteria when they identify these like really important aquatic habitats, these highest priority aquatic habitats. And Lewis Creek sort of checks a couple of the boxes. Lewis Creek supports some rare species, rare mussels. It actually has really high levels of biodiversity of sort of uncommon species as well. And then not all streams are alike. Streams come in different shapes and sizes, different chemistry, different substrates, mountainous streams, valley bottom streams. And, there are different stream types, different stream habitats. And, Lewis Creek is generally considered one of the best examples of its stream habitat type as well. So Hollow Brook, not the entire brook, but headwaters portions of Hollow Brook and headwaters portions of some unnamed tributaries into Hollow Brook have also been identified at the state level as being this really important aquatic habitat. So wetlands and floodplain forest. Hinesburg's got a little bit of leg up, I would say, in terms of other towns, in terms of wetlands mapping. So not to go too deep into the wetlands wormhole, but wetlands across the state of Vermont are regulated on the Vermont Wetlands Rule, and only wetlands that are mapped within the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory fall under the jurisdiction of the Vermont Wetlands Rules. The Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory map, it's a great statewide database, but it is based on older sort of aerial photo interpretation, older mapping technologies. Our land covers have changed some since then. In the 1990s, Hinesburg went and did a town level, and some of the adjacent towns did a town level wetlands mapping. And these are showing up as an advisory wetlands because they do not have the same guaranteed jurisdictional protection of wetlands included on the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. But they are taking both wetland data sets out into the woods. I can tell you that the town level wetlands mapping is by far the sort of superior wetlands data set in the town. And that town level data set includes about 1,500, a little under 1,500 acres of wetlands. Wetlands provide a number of important functions, both for wildlife and the environment, but for people as well. But the functions of these, not every wetland provides every function, and not every wetland provides really high quality function. It doesn't hold true across all wetland functions, but on a lot of them, larger wetlands often provide more functions and provide greater function. And, across the bottom of the graph, bottom of the slide, I've included wetland sizes, the frequency of wetland sizes. And there are very few there are 1,500 acres of wetlands in town, but there are very few wetlands that are over 20 acres in size. I mean, you're just talking about a handful of them. And it's these larger wetlands that really provide a lot of the sort of premier wetland functions. Not that small ones aren't important, it's just the big ones are super important. And actually, that 0 to 10, 682 wetlands under 0 to 10 acres, I could have broken that one down even farther. And the vast majority of those are like under 3 acres in size. So quite a few wetlands in Hinesburg, but generally smaller wetlands. Also, a lot of different wetland types in Hinesburg. About 51% of the wetlands are in this sort of emergent condition, like you see on the top. So these are cattail marshes or marshes where you have sedges or rushes growing up and out of the water, or other herbs growing out of the water, sort of lacking shrub and forest cover. There are also shrub swamps in Hinesburg as well. And then swamps or forested wetlands. There are both deciduous and coniferous swamps in Hinesburg. And I'm going to talk a little bit about significant natural communities and rare, threatened, and endangered species. I'm going to give a definition to a natural community and a significant natural community in a second, so just hang with me. One of the things that I wanted to point out on this slide, which the color doesn't seem to come through very good in PowerPoint, I apologize, but the light tan areas here, these are the priority interior forest blocks and priority connector blocks. And then the darker green areas are the highest priority block. And again, we just have that one highest priority block in town. And, one of the things I wanted to point out is most of the significant natural community occurrences in town, which is shown here in orange, fall within this highest priority block. And that's not coincidence. These interior forest blocks, these habitat blocks were ranked based on the known significant natural community occurrences that were in them as well. So another part of our follow-up phase 2 work is to do some site assessments of the interior forest blocks, the priority interior forest blocks and connector blocks. And as part of that work, we would be looking at the condition of these forested areas, as well as looking for some of the things that sort of feed into the ranking of them, including the presence of significant natural communities. So, most of the significant natural communities in Hinesburg are in the Champlain Valley portion of Hinesburg. So not uncommon, or not unusual, rare natural communities located on top of rare geologic features. So a natural community is, the easiest way to think of it is it's an ecosystem. It's interacting assemblage of plants and animals and the environment that it grows in. There are over 100 different natural community types that have been identified, classified in Vermont. They come in all sorts of different sizes, commonalities, and rarities. Some natural communities like northern hardwood forest are very common in the state and grow across a wide range of environments, whereas other natural communities like a red pine forest are quite rare and only grow in a very limited geologic and topographic setting. So what you're looking at here is the state significant examples. So a state significant natural community occurrence is a subset of natural community occurrences, and it's really the highest quality examples of all the natural community occurrences. And it can be significant, the state can identify as a significant, they have multiple criteria for identifying a significant natural community. One, it can be a really high quality example of a common community, or it can sort of be a medium quality or high quality example of a less common community, or it can really be any example of a rare community. And Hinesburg sort of has them all. Hinesburg has some examples like Music, Maple, Ash, Oak, Hickory Forest, where it has a significant natural community occurrence of that natural community type. But that's a relatively common natural community type, and Hinesburg has a significant occurrence of it because it's a really high quality example. Hinesburg also has some occurrences of very rare natural community types like wet clay plain forest and red pine forest. And these are occurrences that are considered significant mainly because of their rarity, but also because of their condition. I'd just add that this is by no means a systematic assessment of natural communities across the town. This basically represents sites where biologists, ecologists like myself have been able to put boots on the ground to do an assessment. These are areas that parts of the town that someone in the town has already visited and assessed. So just a couple quick photos. Here's an example of clay plain forest. This one's actually from, Charlotte, as the name implies. This is a forest type that's growing in clay soils. And you get a real intermingling of hardwood species more characteristic of southern and central climates, oaks and hickories intermingling with species more typical of Vermont, like maples and ashes. These are generally poorer drained soils. The examples in Hinesburg are specifically of a wetland type or a wetland variety. Sort of going hand in hand with the clay plain forest is this music maple ash oak hickory forest. So when you're actually out in the clay plain, there are these cobbles or knobs or small bedrock hills that sort of rise up out of the clay plain. And those are home to music maple ash oak hickory forests. These are landforms out in the valley that are sticking up out of the clay plain, and they're mantled in thinner soils. They're generally shallow to bedrock. But you still get this incredible intermingling of species like shagbark hickory growing with more northerly species. One of Hinesburg's real gems, I think, is the red pine forest. This one's from Bolton. I did not visit the Hinesburg one. But this is a fire adapted ecosystem. Red pines are generally require fire to effectively regenerate. And these generally only occur in lightning prone, dry ridgelines. And that's exactly where we find it in Hinesburg. These have a lot of red pine in them. But one of the neat features, particularly from a wildlife perspective, is these tend to have a lot of soft mass. These have a very thick understory of blueberries and often a midstory of serviceberries, which are, great berries if you are a bird or a bear or other wildlife. Silver maple floodplain forest. Cedar swamp, also rare natural community type in Hinesburg. So just quickly, a couple pictures on more common natural communities. So probably the most widespread hardwood wetland type in town is a red maple black ash swamp. Northern hardwood forest being the most common forest type, at least of the more mountainous eastern part of town in the Champlain Hills and northern Green Mountains part of town. And then hemlock forest as well. This is a list of rare, threatened, and endangered species. And again, this does not represent a systematic inventory of rare, threatened, and endangered species across town. These are just known locations. A couple things I'd like to point out, and this is pretty common in the Champlain Valley, is you got a number of bat species that are listed as threatened or endangered at the state or federal level in town. We know the Champlain Valley is particularly important for Indiana bats, which are federally endangered. But then we also have northern long-eared bats that are known to be in Hinesburg as well, and little brown bats as well. And then there's this whole host of plant species. Plants don't always get a lot of love under our state rare species protection programs. So there are also other programs identifying rare plants, including the New England Native New England Native Plant Conservancy has identified a number of globally rare and regionally rare plant species that also occur in Hinesburg. Almost all of these rare plant species are located in the Champlain Valley portion of town. A couple other wildlife resources I would like to point out. So in town we have confirmed vernal pools. So vernal pools where someone like myself or Kate has gone out and been able to document actual breeding of vernal pool dependent species. We have ones where we think they might, but we haven't visited. There are mast areas, particularly bear mast areas in town, and mast kind of occurs in a couple different ways in town. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Deer wintering areas, which I'm not going to talk much about tonight. I just wanted to point out, as part of our resource inventory, we did do some remapping of deer wintering areas because the state has mapped deer wintering areas, and there is some regulatory protection of the state mapped deer wintering areas. This is showing up as an advisory layer here and on the online mapper as well. One of the other things I'm going to talk about tonight is potential grassland habitat, showing up in yellow here. And again, on this slide, important point is that most of the grassland habitat is again in the eastern part of town. Sorry, western part of town. So in terms of mast, so the town has a number of hard mast producing tree species that are valuable for wildlife, beech and a variety of different oak species. And these kind of occur in different forms. Beech and oak is sort of peppered throughout our forests of town. And those are important sources of food. But what's really important for wildlife is when these grow in concentrated groves. And, Hinesburg has some groves of mature beech where you have a lot of mature beech growing together and producing a lot of beech nuts. Similar with oak forests, groves of oak where you have a lot of mature oak trees producing a lot of acorns in close proximity. And what's really important from a biodiversity standpoint is not just the concentration of the trees, but that wildlife are actually using them. Particularly bear have a lot of fidelity to these. They come back to the same mast areas year after year. So when we're looking for mast areas, particularly when we're looking for ones that are important for land use planning, management, land management, or conservation, we are looking for mast areas that are showing repeated evidence of bear usage, like the beech tree you see here on the left. It's got repeated years of bears climbing up in them. Oak as well. Vernal pools scattered throughout town as well. So these ephemeral wetlands, I think, are really important to sort of hit in town inventories because they are often missed in our larger wetland mapping efforts. These are small wetlands. They're just small and typically under a forest canopy, so they're hard to find sometimes. We find them on remote sources, not all of them. And then it requires actually going out there and getting boots on the ground to see if they're being used. This is spotted salamanders, one of the species that will breed in vernal pools. Spotted salamanders and other sort of vernal pool dependent species, they will breed in a wider range of aquatic and wetland habitats. But it's vernal pools that really provide the most effective breeding habitats for these guys. It's vernal pools are fish-free bodies of water. Because of their ephemeral, fish can't stay there. Between egg masses, spotted salamander egg mass there, they can sit in that vernal pool without being gobbled up by fish. There's certainly other species like raccoon and possum that are in there eating them. But it's these fish-free vernal pools that really allow spotted salamanders, wood frogs, a couple other species I'll show in a second, to sort of achieve their maximum breeding success. And it's these vernal pools that lets them breed in suboptimal areas like ruts and logging trails or ponds that have a lot of fish in them. And again, when we go out and do our follow-up work, our site assessment work, vernal pools are one of the things we're looking for when we're out there, boots on the ground, because they are difficult to pick up on remote sources. So this is a list of species from the Vermont Wildlife Action Plan. These are species of greatest conservation need that are associated with vernal pools. These are either species that are breeding directly in the pool or species that are going to eat things that are breeding in the vernal pool. Grassland habitats. So when we're talking grassland habitat in Hinesburg, we are talking about Hayfields are the best grassland habitat. Pastures also provide some grassland habitat. Grasslands are a complicated habitat in terms of wildlife, because they require human intervention, but they can also be heavily impacted by that same human intervention. So grasslands in Champlain Valley have become increasingly important to grassland bird species. Bobolink on the left, savanna sparrow on the right here. These are species that nest directly on the ground within grasslands. They are laying their eggs right out there. And these are species that historically weren't really very much part of Vermont's flora. It's just in more recently, Champlain Valley has become really important for the conservation of these species. And that's mostly because what's going on where grasslands are naturally occurring in the plains and Midwest regions of our country. You know, as grasslands have been converted to more intense farming operations or converted to other land uses in the grasslands, these grassland bird species have been displaced, and they are increasingly using the Champlain Valley as sort of hot spots for breeding. But the real challenging part here is you need farmers to farm the hay fields to keep them in grassland condition. But at the same time, that act of mowing, which perpetuates the grassland condition, can be sort of a mass mortality event for these species as well. You know, they've got their eggs and their young right on the ground. The mower comes by, and you can sort of picture how that story ends. Because grasslands of the Champlain Valley are becoming important on the continental scale, and because grasslands provide habitat for a whole host of other important wildlife species, there has been a real dedicated effort in the Champlain Valley to try and find management solutions that balance hay and forage production for farmers with habitat for grassland birds. And most of those strategies revolve around adjusting the timing of harvesting haying, either delaying first cut long enough to let these species lay their young, lay eggs, fledge, and raise their young, or actually delaying long enough between first and second cutting that you're allowing the species to lay their eggs and nest in between first and second cut. So it's complicated. You know, Hinesburg has fantastic, Champlain Valley has fantastic grassland habitat, but we just can't let it sit there. You know, we have to manage it, and we have to manage it in a way, if we want to have grassland birds, we have to manage it in a way that meets the farmer's needs and the birds' needs, which is complicated. So this will nice sort of transition into talking a little bit about more human-oriented natural resources and the town's farmland resources. You know, on this map, the brown and the orange are important agricultural soils, the orange being our prime soils, and the browns being soils of statewide importance. So these are the soils that are really most productive for farming purposes. And again, those are mostly concentrated in the Champlain Valley portion of town. Also on here are farms, and then in the red I just outlined are fields. And these were the fields we delineated as part of this resource inventory, as part of this phase one. And the farms were also, these were active farms, at least as of, I guess, 2019 when we compiled this list. But farms are an important part of Hinesburg's culture, important part of Hinesburg's aesthetic, and a super important part of Hinesburg's wildlife habitats. And you know, and of course, most of these farming resources are correlated to this activity of this glacial lake between 10 and 20,000 years ago. You know, the farming resources are really mostly where this lake dropped down clay soils or dropped down sandy or silty soils. So Hinesburg, which compared to many other towns in the state of Vermont, and really compared to most towns outside of the Champlain Valley, has a lot of important agricultural soils. So even though Hinesburg has a lot of important agricultural soils, it's important to recognize that the important agricultural soils make up just a fraction of the town, a small part of the town. So around 5% of the town is the prime agricultural soils. These are really the best farming soils and the best soils for maintaining grassland habitat as well. And then a quarter of the town is in soils of statewide importance for agricultural, also good agricultural soils, some of those needing some drainage to make them really effective farming soils. But sort of the take-home message here is, even in a town like Hinesburg that's got a lot of prime ag soils or got a lot of important ag soils, 65% of the town is sort of in this sort of non-important ag soil. Not that there aren't farms on those areas, it's just the farms on those areas tend to be, farm fields in those areas tend to be more pastures, less hay fields and crops. So we also did look at, as part of our field mapping, we looked at the different types of fields in town, and particularly in the Champlain Valley, it's important to understand this as sort of a snapshot in time because fields are used rotationally. So about 66% of the fields we mapped were in hay production. Of course, these hay fields may also be rotated among corn in different years. And in the Champlain Valley, we also see a lot of hay fields that may be cut in first and second cut and then, grazed after that. About a quarter of the fields mapped are in this sort of permanent pasture areas. And then about 11% of the town is in crops, primarily corn, but hemp as well. And again, those figures would change a little bit depending on sort of what year and maybe the sort of time of year you did this analysis. But in terms of the grassland birds that we were just talking about, it's the hay fields that are the real important areas. So I'm going to bring us, even though I didn't talk about maybe all the resources, I'm going to bring us towards wrapping up here. And I got to talk a little bit about farming resources and areas of the town that are important for farming, but there's some corollaries or parallels with parts of the town that are important for forestry as well. There's certain soil types in town that are much more productive for forestry, much more important for forestry. And there are also parts of town that are really important for recreation as well, natural resources that are really important for recreation. And I think that this sort of diversity of land uses, having working farms, having working forests, having natural areas, all in a pretty tight proximity is, one of the things that makes Hinesburg special. This diversity of land uses equates to a diversity of different habitats, equates to a wide range of different wildlife species in town. So this is sort of my list of Hinesburg special natural resources. This is sort of from the gut here. This is not, my analysis, or this is my feeling. But I also think that the diversity of soils and the diversity of landforms in Hinesburg also are really special. It means that we have natural communities, Valley Clay Plain Forest, very near red pine forest, or Valley Clay Plain Forest, very near forest types more characteristic of the Green Mountains. So a lot in a small area. And this is, of course, also relates to its sort of transitional landscape. The town itself is on this really major transition between the Champlain Valley and Green Mountains. So we get this intermingling of sort of warmer and cooler species across the town, which you guys get to enjoy all within the confines of your town. And other folks, drive from one side of the state to sort of see that same levels of diversity. Sort of moving down the list is there's this high concentration of rare species and significant natural communities concentrated in the Champlain Valley portion of Hinesburg. There's no denying that the Champlain Valley part of Hinesburg is really important aspect of the town's sort of natural heritage. Rare bats. The town has multiple rare bat species in it, using a variety of different habitats across town. Grassland and shrubland habitats are a really important natural resource in town. I did not get to talk about the shrubland habitats tonight, but similar to grassland, there are bird species that are really dependent on shrubland habitats, and the Champlain Valley is becoming increasingly important for some of those species, like golden wing warbler. And then, my last bullet there is these are, special natural resources in town, but these are also special natural resources that we should be worried about and that have some threats to them. Agricultural soils to farming. We, in the state of Vermont, farming is immensely important to us, yet we lose lots of agricultural soils every year to development, particularly in the Champlain Valley. And we know those agricultural soils are tremendously important for farming. And, Hinesburg and the Champlain Valley has a really important role in grassland habitat at the continental scale. And those important agricultural soils translate to good wildlife habitat as well. And then unfragmented habitat blocks and road crossings, these go hand in hand. In town, if we want to sustain species like moose, bear, fisher, species that need lots of interior forest, the areas of unfragmented interior forest need to be a priority, and the connections between those also need to be a priority. So we're at 7:03. I don't know where folks are in terms of having to leave to the meeting, but we could do a little question and answer time if folks have any questions.
Yeah, I think the planning commissioners have already taken off, is my understanding. Okay. So
I'm seeing, yep.
Anyone else can feel free to chime in with questions for Jesse.
I have a question. I know in the next coming week, there's a plan to administer herbicide into Lake Iroquois, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
That's a little outside of my wheelhouse. I'm on Lake Fairleigh here, or Lake Morey here in Fairleigh, and we've got the treatment happening this week as well. And I was just asked that same question by one of my neighbors, and I'm not prepared to answer that. I apologize.
That's okay.
I have a question. In your block of what you showed as the Champlain Valley, the dark green, it seems to stop at Silver Street, and yet that same geology goes across Silver Street into the calcareous soils and bedrock that are between Silver Street and Gilman Road. So is that just what showed up on the conservation design map? And was there some, I don't know, I'm just curious about.
So it relates to the habitat block, right? So the habitat block is an unfragmented forest that's not crossed by roads. So the delineation of that habitat block ended at Silver Street. And what Vermont Conservation Design is saying is that unfragmented chunk of forest that's on top of that rare geology is what's important. So, as we move farther south, and particularly as we move south out of Hinesburg and that same belt of geology continues, there are other blocks of highest priority habitat on that same belt of geology. But it needs to be sort of a relatively large block of unfragmented forest.
Right, and I guess it's I guess there's just a little bit more of development on that same geology on the east side of Silver Street, not on the west side.
Okay, well, the habitat block delineations also exclude, these are forested areas and wetland areas, so houses, developments, lawns, hayfields have been excluded from those delineations as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, Andrea, and well, I guess Jesse and anyone else too. I mean, I guess that's one, limitation to these maps is that they don't necessarily look at, what this could be in 200 years. If we did restoration work and planted trees and turned everything back to, whatever on some special geology location, maybe in 200 or 400 years, we'd be saying, hey, great, this is, part of this big forest block. But currently it's based on what's on the ground now, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jesse.
Yes. Well, yes, you're correct. That data set does exist though. So as part of the Vermont conservation design, they identified habitat blocks that are also important because of their underlying geology and their underlying geology alone. And these were areas that did not rise to the criteria of being a priority or highest priority block because the forest cover there is really degraded or impacted. But these are areas that overlie rare geology, and conceptually you should be able to restore them to a rare natural community type. So that data is actually out there and can sort of be filtered to answer that really great question of, where are important areas to restore.
Right. And I would add that it's not only what areas to restore, but what areas to protect currently, so that we don't get greater fragmentation in these highly sensitive and unusual places. So that those geology and soil types in there, while they may be somewhat fragmented at this point, the more that we can do to prevent further fragmentation and then restoration, it seems like that's where we should be concentrating, and that's what planning is, right? Is like looking at the potentiality of restoration and what we can do to protect them. So I'll just share the good news that in terms of unfragmented and protecting interior forest, Hinesburg Town Forest is just awarded $225,000 grant towards protecting another 291 acres contiguous to the town forest and to Fred Johnson Wildlife Management Area. So,
right. Congratulations.
That's going to be thousands of, over 3,000 acres now of interior forests that will be protected with conservation easement. Well, only 1,200 acres or 1,300 acres with an easement. But anyway, it's kind of cool.
That's very cool. Yeah.
Any other questions for Jesse?
I think it's a great presentation. Thanks very much. And I hope that there can be more participants in doing some of the on the ground truthing and the roadside crossings. We did a lot of that in the early 90s, and it'll be great to see if we can get some citizen volunteers and understand what to be looking for. One thing that you didn't mention was roadkill, and in terms of identifying where the crossings are, which is an unfortunate way of doing it, but we do know that's an indication of our aquatic species as well as our fur-bearing species.
Sadly true. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Jesse. I appreciate your presentation tonight. And in case anyone's not aware, the online mapper is up on the new Hinesburg Town website on our Conservation Commission page, so you can link to it from there. And I will work with the town on getting some of those maps that Jesse showed tonight that are sort of stagnant, like PDF type maps up there as well. So you can download those and check them out. If you're not comfortable with the online mapper and turning on and off layers, that you can sort of just look at the some of the overall picture of some of these resources. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jess.